My mother was a planner. I do not mean this in the ordinary sense, in the sense that she kept a tidy calendar or arrived early to appointments, though she did those things too. I mean it in the deeper sense. I mean that my mother had a particular relationship with the future, a way of holding it in her mind as something that required preparation, care, and deliberate arrangement. She had grown up with very little and had spent her adult life building something from nothing, and because she had built it from nothing, she understood in her bones what it meant to have it and what it meant to lose it. She did not take the stability she had created for granted. And she was not naive about the people who surrounded it. She was 58 years old when she died. Pancreatic cancer, which announced itself in January and finished its work by April, the cruelest timeline, the one that gives you just enough information to understand what is happening but not enough time to make peace with it. I was 29. I had moved back home for the last 6 weeks of her life, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, spending my days in the particular intimacy of terminal illness, the medications, the adjustments, the honest conversations that happen when the ordinary social contracts of pretense fall away and there is only the truth of what matters and what does not. My father had remarried 4 years earlier. His wife, I will call her Diane, because that is her name and I see no reason to protect her with an alias, had entered our family with the confident efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of vacancy. She was pleasant enough on the surface. The kind of pleasant that requires effort and therefore signals, to anyone paying attention, that the pleasantness is not natural but constructed. My mother had seen it immediately. She had said to me once, in the particular shorthand of mothers and daughters who understand each other deeply, "She is always calculating. Watch her hands when she thinks no one is looking." I had thought this was grief talking, the residue of a painful divorce. I had not yet learned to trust it as what it actually was, accurate perception. The funeral was a Wednesday in late April. The kind of spring day that feels like an insult when you are burying someone, all pale warmth and new leaves and birds performing their indifference to human loss. The church was full. My mother had been the kind of woman who accumulated genuine affection over a lifetime, the kind who showed up for people and was therefore shown up for in return. I sat in the front pew between my younger brother, Marcus, and my Aunt Cecilia, my mother's sister, and I held a program with my mother's photograph on the front, and I did the particular work of public grief, staying present, staying upright, receiving people's condolences with something resembling composure. Diane sat across the aisle with my father. She was dressed appropriately. I noticed this, the way you notice small things when you are hyper-vigilant with grief, in quiet navy blue rather than anything that would draw attention. She held my father's hand. She dabbed her eyes at the right moments. She was doing everything correctly. And I watched her do it with that observation running beneath my grief like a low-frequency sound. She is calculating. Watch her hands. The reception at the house afterward was when I first felt it. The shift. Diane moving through the rooms of my mother's house. My father had bought it with my mother, had lived in it with my mother for 19 years before their divorce, and my mother had remained in it, had built her life inside it, had died in it, with a proprietary ease that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just the way she touched things. The way her eyes moved across surfaces. The way she said to someone, in a voice I only half caught, "Of course we'll need to think about the property now. Of course we'll need to think about the property." I stored that sentence. I stored it the way my mother had taught me to store things, carefully, without reaction, in the private archive that you keep for later. I smiled at the guests. I ate nothing. I watched Diane move through the rooms of the house where my mother had lived and died, and I thought, she knows something I don't know yet. And whatever she knows, she thinks it benefits her. I was right. She just did not know what my mother had already done about it. It was 11 days after the funeral. The sympathy flowers had started to die. There is a grim punctuality to this, the way the condolence bouquets begin to droop just as the first sharp edge of grief is supposed to be softening, when Diane asked my father to arrange a family meeting. I drove to the house on a Sunday afternoon. Marcus came from his apartment across town. My father sat at the kitchen table that had been my mother's kitchen table, in the kitchen where my mother had made every Sunday meal of my childhood, and Diane sat beside him with a manila folder on the table in front of her and the look on her face of someone who has been rehearsing for this. I knew before she opened her mouth. I want to be clear about this. Some part of me knew. The sentence from the reception had been sitting in my archive for 11 days, and I had been building around it, adding to it, finding its shape. I knew. She opened by expressing her condolences again. This is a detail I find the most remarkable in retrospect, that she began with condolences, that she used the language of sympathy as a threshold for what she was about to say, as if sorrow and strategy could occupy the same sentence without one contaminating the other. She said she knew this was a difficult time. She said she had the greatest respect for my mother. She said these things, and they were plainly, structurally untrue, but she said them with a face that had been trained to deliver them. Then she pushed the folder across the table. Inside were documents, assessments, estimates, some printed pages from financial records. She had done her research. My mother had built her estate over 30 years, the house, some investments, a savings portfolio, a life insurance policy, and its total value sat somewhere around $400,000. Diane had clearly taken some care to understand this number, because she cited it with a precision that told me she had not arrived at it casually. The argument she made was this: my father had contributed to the house in the early years of their marriage, before the divorce. That contribution, she said, entitled him to a share of the estate. And since they were now married, his entitlement was, by extension, hers. She spoke about community property. She used the word partnership. She said, and this is a sentence that has lived in me with the longest afterlife, your mother was a wonderful woman, but she can't have expected the two of you to simply take everything without consideration of what's fair. The two of you. Marcus and I, her stepdaughter and stepson, in the house where we had grown up, 11 days after we had buried our mother, being told that our inheritance was a matter of fairness that required her input. Marcus went very still beside me. I know my brother well enough to know that his stillness is not the stillness of someone who has nothing to say. It is the stillness of someone who is deciding very carefully how much of what they are thinking to allow into the room. I put my hand on his arm, just briefly, just a touch that meant, not yet. My father said nothing. This was the most painful part. He sat at the table with Diane's folder open in front of him, and he did not look at us, and he said nothing, and I understood with a clarity that was both new and ancient, the kind of understanding that settles something you have been half knowing for a long time, that he had agreed to this. Not reluctantly, not under pressure in the last 5 minutes. He had agreed to this before we arrived. I looked at Diane. I kept my face very still. I said, I'm going to need to speak to my mother's lawyer before I respond to any of this. She had clearly expected something more reactive. There was a brief flicker, barely visible, but there, of recalibration. Of course, she said. Take whatever time you need. What she did not know, and what I did not yet know either, was that my mother's lawyer was already expecting my call. That my mother had, in the careful and far-sighted way of someone who plans for futures that haven't happened yet, already anticipated this exact room. This exact conversation. This exact folder. My mother had been a planner. I had not yet understood the full extent of what she had planned. I called the office of Raymond Okafor the following morning. He had been my mother's attorney for 16 years. I had met him twice at family events. A quiet man with precise language and the kind of calm that comes from spending decades in rooms where people are at their worst. His receptionist told me he had actually been trying to reach me. That he had a standing instruction to contact me following the formal mourning period, and that if I was available, he would like to meet in person. I drove to his office on Tuesday. I sat across from his desk in a chair that had probably held 100 people in the midst of some version of what I was in the midst of, and he offered me water and I said yes, and he opened a file folder and he said, Your mother wanted me to make sure you heard this directly from me and not from anyone else first. He then told me about the trust. My mother had established it 3 years earlier. Not when she was diagnosed. Before. when she was healthy and sharp and watching the landscape of her life with the long, clear gaze that had always distinguished her. She had watched Diane enter the family. She had drawn her own conclusions. And she had gone to Raymond Aquifer, and she had constructed something that could not be argued with, petitioned against, or diluted by a folder of printed pages pushed across a kitchen table. The trust was specific. It named Marcus and me as sole beneficiaries. It outlined the distribution of the house, the investment portfolio, the savings, the life insurance proceeds. It had been drafted with careful language that addressed, directly and explicitly, the matter of my father's prior contributions to the property, a matter that had been legally settled as part of their divorce agreement more than 4 years earlier and had no remaining claim on the estate. Raymond showed me that document too. The divorce settlement. My mother had had the foresight to ensure that any property claims were formally resolved and documented. There was no opening. There was no ambiguity. The folder Diane had pushed across the table was, from a legal standpoint, a document of wishes, not rights. And wishes, without the architecture to support them, are simply wishes. But there was one more thing. And this is the part that made me have to stop and hold the edge of Raymond's desk for a moment, because it came with a weight I had not prepared for. He handed me an envelope. It had my name on it in my mother's handwriting, not printed, handwritten, in the particular cursive she had never abandoned even as the rest of the world moved to block letters and keyboards. He said she had left it with him the last time she had updated the trust documents, about a year before her diagnosis. I did not open it in his office. I thanked him. I asked every practical question I needed to ask. I took the documents he had prepared for me, the summary of the trust, the legal outline of what it meant and what was protected. I shook his hand. I went to my car and I sat in the parking structure for a while before I was ready to drive. I opened the envelope at home, at my own kitchen table, with the door locked and my phone face down and no sound in the apartment. She had written 3 pages. I will not reproduce all of it here because some of it is mine alone, the private inheritance of words between a mother and her daughter that belonged to no one else. But she had said this, that she knew I would be sitting somewhere wondering how she had known to do all of this, and that the answer was simply that she had always known exactly who Diane was because she had recognized her. She had met women like Diane before, women who moved toward other people's built things with the confidence of entitlement, and she had not let herself pretend otherwise out of politeness. She said, "I built what I built for you and your brother. I did not do that so that someone else could reframe it as a negotiation. You don't have to fight, sweetheart. Everything is already handled. You just have to hold your ground." I sat at my kitchen table and I held my mother's letter and I cried in the way that only that specific kind of love can make you cry, not from pain only, but from the staggering, humbling fact of being known, of having been considered, of receiving, from beyond a death, the proof that someone had seen far enough ahead to protect you from what was coming. She had seen it. She had planned for it. She had handled it. I was not alone in this room. I had never been alone in this room. Diane did not accept the trust quietly. I want to say this plainly because I think there is a temptation, in telling a story that ends well legally, to minimize what happened in between. The middle of this story was not quiet. It was not clean. It was expensive in money, in time, in emotional energy, and in the particular cost of watching family fracture along the fault lines that a crisis exposes. Within 2 weeks of my meeting with Raymond, Diane had retained her own attorney. The argument they constructed rested on 2 pillars. The first was the claim that my mother had lacked the mental capacity to establish the trust at the time she did, that she had been, as their filing put it, unduly influenced by outside parties, meaning, presumably, Raymond and her sister Cecilia, who had witnessed several of the trust updates. This claim required them to establish that my mother, a woman of 55 who had driven herself to every legal appointment, who had written 3 lucid and precise pages of personal correspondence, who had reviewed and amended documents across multiple years, had somehow been too compromised to manage her own estate decisions. It was not a strong argument, but it was an argument, and arguments cost money to defeat even when they are baseless. The second pillar was a property claim, an expanded version of what Diane had presented in the kitchen, this time with additional documentation intended to reframe the scope of my father's original contributions. Raymond had anticipated this. The divorce settlement remained definitive. But anticipating an argument and defeating it in a formal process are different things, and different things cost different amounts of time. There were 3 months of back and forth. There were documents I had to gather, sign, notarize. There were depositions. I sat across a conference table from Diane's lawyer and answered questions for 2 hours, and I was careful and clear and honest, and I said exactly what I knew and nothing that I didn't, and when her lawyer implied, in one artfully framed question, that my relationship with my mother had perhaps not been as close as I claimed, I looked at him steadily and I said, "My mother wrote me a 3-page letter that I received after her death anticipating this exact situation. I would say that indicates a relatively close relationship. Would you like a copy?" He moved on. The family dimension was its own separate devastation. My father called me twice during this period. The first call was defensive. He said that Diane had his best interests at heart, that this was about fairness, that my mother had always been difficult about money. I let him say it. I did not argue. I said, "Dad, I love you. But this is not something I can give you." The second call was quieter. He said he was sorry. He didn't specify for what. I accepted it anyway, because he is my father and because some ledgers are kept privately and some are let go, and I was still working out which this one was. Marcus was furious throughout. Where I had learned from my mother to be still and watchful, my brother had inherited her other quality, the one that burned. He wanted to escalate at every turn, to meet every provocation with maximum force. I spent as much energy managing his anger as I did navigating the legal process, and I do not say this critically. His anger was righteous. It was correct. It was also not useful at full volume, and I told him so, and he told me I was too controlled, and we had a genuine argument about it in my car outside a restaurant, and then we got pasta, and he told me he was proud of me, and I cried a little, and he pretended not to see, which is a particular language of siblings. There were moments when I was exhausted in a way that went beyond tired. When I woke at Lingsan Samdim with the weight of it pressing down, not fear that I would lose, because Raymond had been clear about the strength of our position, but the sheer grinding fatigue of having to fight for something that should not have required a fight. Of having to spend the first year of my grief in a legal process rather than simply inside my grief. Of having to be organized and strategic and careful when all I wanted was to be a daughter who had lost her mother and was allowed to be undone by it without also being required to defend against it. I thought about my mother's letter on those nights. I thought about the sentence, "You don't have to fight. Everything is already handled. You just have to hold your ground." I held it. On the nights when I didn't want to, I held it anyway. Because she had done the harder work before I even knew there was work to be done, and the least I could do was stand in the place she had prepared for me. The judge ruled on a Thursday in November, 7 months after my mother's funeral. Raymond called me at Sheng Sabyatim. I was at work. I am a graphic designer, and I was in the middle of a client revision, which is a profoundly surreal thing to be doing when you are waiting for a phone call about your mother's estate. I stepped into the corridor outside my office, and I answered, and Raymond said, "It's done. The trust stands." The court found no merit in the capacity claim and declined to reopen the property question given the existing divorce settlement. Everything transfers to you and Marcus as stipulated. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Your mother was very thorough." I said, "Yes, she was." We finished the call. I stood in the corridor for a moment. The overhead light was fluorescent and slightly too bright in the way of office corridors, and someone walked past me carrying a coffee mug, and outside the window the November sky was the particular flat gray of the season. None of it was cinematic. None of it had the quality of an ending you might arrange for effect. It was just a Thursday morning in a corridor with fluorescent lights, and my mother's work had held, and it was done. The actual feeling arrived later, at home, in the evening. I had called Marcus from the car. He had made a sound I had never heard from him before, something between a shout and exhale, pure relief without the shape of words, and I had sat in the parking structure laughing and crying at the same time while he recovered himself on the other end of the line. We made plans for the weekend. We would go to the house, our mother's house, which was ours now, which we would need to decide together what to do with, and we would be there as her children in a way we had not yet been allowed to be, without the shadow of the process over us. But at home, alone, I sat with the full accounting. What had been won? The house, the investments, the savings, the insurance proceeds. The $400,000 my mother had built from a life of careful, deliberate work. This was real and it mattered, and I do not want to minimize it with an excess of sentiment. Money is real, financial security is real, and my mother had known that better than anyone, which was why she had built it and protected it. But what moved me most, sitting with it that Thursday evening, was not the money. It was the evidence. The evidence of how my mother had loved me, practically, specifically, with her eyes open. She had not simply loved me in the warm, general way. She had loved me with enough clarity to look at the landscape around me and identify the risks and build a structure to protect me from them. She had sat with Raymond Aquifer and worked through legal documents with the same care she had applied to everything, because she understood that love without preparation is just feeling, and feeling without structure can be undone. She had not just felt her love for me. She had built it into something that could stand without her. I thought about Diane. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about this because triumph would be simple, and what I felt was not simple. I felt something more like sadness, for the waste of it, for the months of process and cost and family fracture that had come from her inability to look at something that belonged to other people and leave it alone. I felt sorry for my father, who had been positioned between his wife and his children and had made choices that would take time to repair. I felt the specific sorrow of watching adults behave badly in ways that cannot be attributed to confusion or youth, but only to the ordinary human failures of greed and insecurity. I did not wish her harm. I wished her a different nature. Those are different wishes. I poured a glass of wine. I sat on my couch. I took my mother's letter from the drawer where I kept it, and I did not read it. I had it memorized by now. I did not need to read it. I just held it. The 3 pages in her handwriting. The practical and loving architecture of her foresight. I see you, Mama, I said, to the empty room. I see what you did. The room was quiet. The November dark pressed at the windows. And I held her letter, and I felt, beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the relief, the bedrock of something that does not dissolve, the knowledge that I had been loved carefully. That someone had looked ahead on my behalf. That I had not been left unprepared. That is not a small inheritance. That may be the largest one she left me. There is a version of this story in which my mother did not plan. In which she trusted that decency would prevail, that people would behave with the dignity the situation called for, that a grieving daughter would be allowed to grieve without also being required to defend what was hers. I think about that version sometimes. I think about the woman in that story who drives to the family meeting without knowing what is in the folder, who sits across from Diane's calculation without the knowledge that her mother has already answered it. I think about how undefended she would be. My mother did not leave me undefended. What I understand now that I did not fully understand before, love has many languages. There is the language of presence, of showing up, of sitting beside someone, of being there. My mother spoke that language fluently, and I have never doubted it. But there is also the language of preparation, of thinking past the present into the difficult futures and quietly, carefully arranging the landscape so that the people you love have ground to stand on when the difficulty arrives. My mother spoke that language too, more fluently than I had known. The money is secure. The house will be sold or kept. Marcus and I are still deciding. The legal process is finished, and the documents are filed, and the thing Diane wanted is the thing she did not receive. These are facts. They are good facts. I am grateful for them. But when I think about my mother now, and I think about her every day, which is what happens when you love someone and lose them, and the loss does not diminish with time but only changes shape, what I think about most is a woman sitting in a lawyer's office years before she was sick, years before the end was imaginable, looking at the future with clear and loving eyes and saying, "Let me make sure she is taken care of. Let me build something that will stand after I cannot." She could not stay. So she left me something better than her presence. She left me her thinking, her care, her long, clear gaze turned on my future. That is the $400,000 inheritance. And also it is not. Because the money can be spent and the legal documents will yellow with time and even the house will eventually be someone else's. But the knowledge that I was loved with that quality of attention, carefully, specifically, practically, with eyes open, that is the inheritance no one can file a claim against. That one is mine. It always will be. Some people love you in the moment. The rare ones love you into the future, quietly arranging things you will not discover until you need them most. If you are lucky enough to have been loved that way, you will know it not when everything is easy, but when everything is hard.